Hey everybody, this is our third and final video in the civil rights series, and in this video we're going to focus on other groups and their fight for equality and talk a little bit about the historical sort of struggle that these other groups have had to achieve equality in the United States also. Although we spent a lot of time talking about the African American experience, several other groups also faced similar obstacles in trying to overcome oppression and segregation and discrimination in the United States. So we'll start off talking about the women's rights movement. So the women's rights movement is a long-standing, ongoing struggle for gender equality, evolving from sort of 19th century abolitionist roots into a global movement for social, political, and economic liberation. Key milestones include the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, the 1920 ratification of the 19th Amendment, and the battles of the 60s and 70s for reproductive rights and workplace equality. There were a lot of different focus areas. So there's been the focus on women's suffrage, which was the central focus of the first wave, trying to get full political participation in voting for women. There was a focus on economic equality, access to better jobs, equal pay, better working conditions. They also worked to combat discrimination and violence against women. So, in terms of reproductive rights, they wanted control over their own bodies and bodily autonomy to make decisions about what should happen to women made by women. The first movement was really from the mid 19th century until about the 1920s. This is the one that focused on suffrage and voting and property rights and legal status. The second wave, which occurred in the 1960s through about 1980, address broader issues like workplace discrimination, sexuality, family, and reproductive rights. The third and fourth waves, which kind of are the 90s to today, focus on intersectionality, where the women's movement sort of intersects with things like sexual identity and sexual harassment and bodily autonomy and systemic violence. Early leaders included Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, which were the organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention, which was a women's suffrage convention, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth. Alice Paul, who led the National Women's Party, and Carrie Chapman Catt helped to really push suffrage, while the National Organization for Women has been central to legal and policy shifts since the 60s. There have been some key milestones that are worth noting. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention. In 1920, the 19th Amendment passes, which guarantees women's right to vote. In 1963, Betty Friedan writes The Feminine Mystique, which sparks sort of second wave feminism. Now, second wave feminism is a particularly interesting concept in that it's a social and political movement that sought equality for women in all areas of life beyond voting rights. It emerged in the 60s. It was post World War II, and it lasted for about 20 years with the onset of third wave feminism. While that first wave we talked about focused primarily on voting, the second one looked at employment, education, reproductive rights, family roles, sexuality, legal inequalities that were really important. 1972 ushered in the passage of Title IX, which provided equal access for women to education. 94 saw the Violence Against Women Act passed. And so the current movement continues to address issues like equal pay, reproductive rights, and combating sexual harassment. There's also several indigenous groups that it's important to note. So, Native Americans, there may be no group in history that we've discriminated against more than Native Americans. And so, the Native American Civil Rights Movement, or the Red Power Movement, gained momentum in the late 1960s and 70s, emphasizing self determination, treaty rights, and sovereignty for indigenous peoples. Key organizations like the American Indian Movement led protests and legal challenges, including the occupation of Alcatraz in the late 1960s and the Trail of Broken Treaties in the 1970s. The goal was to combat systemic injustices and police brutality, as well as the federal government's failure to uphold treaties. The era also saw important legislative victories such as the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 and the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, which expanded tribal control and protected individual rights. The real key areas of activism for Native Americans have centered around fighting for the federal government to honor its existing treaty obligations and respect the rights of tribes to govern themselves and control their own lands and resources. There's also been a really strong push for self-determination, where tribes just wanted control over their education, their healthcare, their social services within their communities, culminating in the Indian Self-Determination and Assistance and Self-Assistance Act of, sorry about that, and Assistance Act of 1975. There's also been a push to preserve their culture, to ensure that the Native American culture is not lost, and try to revitalize the languages and spiritual practices. Activists addressed issues like poverty, high unemployment, poor housing, and discrimination, trying to use the justice system as a way to propel themselves to gaining some of the equality that other groups in America have sort of had for some time. It is hard to talk about the Native American struggle for civil rights without noting how intertwined the sort of creation of the country is with sort of the Native American struggle. It is distinct from the mainstream civil rights movement. As I mentioned, they fought for sovereignty. They also fought against termination and relocation and trying to force the federal government to be honest about how it had used Native American funds and how it had misappropriated some of those funds. There were other groups, Asian Americans. Their movement was a period of social and political activism that began in the 1960s. It was inspired by the Black Power and anti Vietnam War movements and worked to combat systemic discrimination, achieve social justice, and establish a unified Pan Asian identity. Remember, there are lots of Asian countries. And the more sort of places that you come from, the harder it can be to establish sort of a unified identity. Key goals included establishing Asian American studies programs, fighting for reparations for Japanese Americans that were interred, and ending discriminatory immigration laws. All of this culminated in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. The civil rights movement for Japanese Americans' legacy includes fighting anti Asian racism and creating a lasting movement for equality with significant events like the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982 sparring further activism. So it's important to note that the inspiration for the Asian American sort of civil rights movement came from the radical policies and anti racist ideals of the Black liberation movement, as well as I mentioned the anti war movement and the Chicano rights movement. Activists like Yuji Ichikawa, who coined the term Asian American in 1968, sought to create a unified identity that could help harness the power of various Asian ethnic groups to fight against racism and imperialism. They were also dissatisfied over the forced internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, coupled with ongoing discrimination in immigration, education, and housing. This fueled the call for collective action and led to some major victories in the form of the creation of Asian American studies programs in universities that would help people to provide a more accurate understanding of Asian American history and experiences. There are also community organizations like the Asian Americans for Equality that emerge from protest against discriminatory hiring practices, becoming a vital resource for workers and tenants facing exploitation. They also worked to reform immigration laws, where the movement's pressure contributed to the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that replaced discriminatory quota systems and transformed the demographics of the United States, leading to Asian Americans being one of the fastest growing minority demographic groups in the country. We also saw a significant fight for Latino rights over the decades. The Latino civil rights movement encompassed efforts by Mexican Americans, the Chicano movement, Puerto Ricans, and other Hispanic groups. They fought for equality against discrimination through protests, labor organizing, and political activism from the 1960s onwards. Key goals included ending segregation, securing workers' rights, achieving educational and political empowerment, and reclaiming their cultural identity. Major figures like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta organized farm workers, while groups like the Brown Berets addressed urban issues and student walkouts demanded educational reform. In the Chicano movement, that focused on the rights of Mexican Americans, emphasizing self empowerment, a sense of history, and community control of their own resources. The United Farm Workers, led by Huerta and Chavez, organized farm workers to demand better wages and working conditions through boycotts and negotiations. The Brown Berets, inspired by the Black Panthers, protested police brutality and fought for educational equality in urban areas. The East LA walkouts, also known sometimes as East LA blowouts, Chicano students walked out of schools to protest discriminatory educational practices and demand a curriculum that reflected their culture. The creation of the LULAC, or the League of United Latin American Citizens, has been a long lasting civil rights group that focused on combating racism and promoting the empowerment of Mexican American middle class men. They fought for economic justice, fighting for better wages, working conditions, and union contracts, particularly for farm workers. They demanded educational reform, which fought for equitable education that validated Chicano culture and history. It led to the creation of many Chicano studies programs. Political empowerment that advocated for increased political representation and the right to vote, which were all seen as fundamental to all the other rights. Cultural pride, which emphasized a cultural nationalism and a sense of identity, often referred to as Chicanismo. It sought to reclaim and study the indigenous and the heritage of Latino individuals, acknowledging that they came from lots of different places and that those needed to be highlighted and celebrated. I mentioned how key Chavez and Huerta were with the UFW. Rodolfo Gonzalez, who was a poet and activist who articulated the goals of the Chicano movement and the idea of La Raza. Reyes Lopez Tijerina, a leader in the New Mexico land grant movement who fought to reclaim some ancestral lands that had been taken over the years. And there have also been key court cases, cases like Mendez versus Westminster and Hernandez versus Texas, that outlawed segregation and established equal protection for Mexican Americans. There's also been increased political representation, though their representation lags behind the amount of people in the population, but they have made significant strides in achieving more civil rights across the US. The LGBTQ plus movement is a centuries long struggle for social, political, and cultural equity for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. It was catalyzed by events like the Stonewall riots, which sparked the modern gay liberation movement. Key goals included the decriminalization of homosexuality, legal recognition of same sex relationships, and protections against discrimination. The movement has achieved significant milestones, such as the legalization of same sex marriage in 2016 and non discrimination protections in employment, but they continue to fight for full equality against ongoing opposition. The first documented gay rights group, which was the Society for Human Rights, was founded by Henry Gerber in Chicago in 1924. We also saw organizations like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Vitalis, who were focused on education, community building, and assimilation in the 1950s and 60s. We saw some key protests, such as the Compton Cafeteria Uprising in 1966, that fought against police brutality and state sanctioned discrimination. The main catalyst for change, though, were the Stonewall Uprising in 1969. A raid by the police on the Stonewall Inn, which was a notorious sort of gay spot in New York, in Greenwich Village, led to an outpouring of protests and violent clashes, which became known as the Stonewall Riots. The uprising served as a catalyst for the modern LGBTQ movement and the ensuing gay liberation movement, which led to an explosion of LGBTQ groups at annual Pride marches. The 1970s and 80s started to see some of these efforts pay off in increased political activism and shifts in public attitudes, which culminated in policy change. The Supreme Court decision in Lawrence versus Texas legalized same sex sexual activity. In 2010, Congress allowed openly gay people to serve in the military. And in 2016, Obergefell v. Hodges overturned the Defense of Marriage Act and made same-sex marriage legal nationwide under the 14th Amendment. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that federal law prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in employment. However, despite the significant process, there's still powerful opposition to LGBTQ rights and protections. Because the movement encompasses a wide range of identities and debates on strategy, inclusion, and the intersection of gender, sexuality, race, and class all still occur, there have been some challenges that the movement has faced. More recently, the opposition has targeted the fundamental rights of transgender people, particularly transgender youth, which has caused the movement to have some struggles in figuring out how to brand itself in this political climate. The final group we'll take a look at are individuals that have disabilities. The disabled civil rights movement, or the disability rights movement, fought for equal rights, inclusion, and accessibility for people with disabilities. It drew inspiration from using similar tactics to the Black civil rights movement. Sorry about that. Key moments included the 1978 Gang of 19 protest for accessible public transit, the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, prohibiting discrimination in federally funded programs, and the landmark Americans with Disabilities Act, which mandated accessibility in employment, public services, and commercial facilities. The goal of the movement was easy. It was simple. The movement aimed to end segregation and discrimination, ensuring that people with disabilities could participate fully in public education, employment, transportation, and public life. A core goal was the removal of physical and communication barriers, as seen in the push for wheelchair lifts on buses and accessible public websites. Folks with disabilities also wanted autonomy and independent living. The movement advocated for the rights of people with disabilities to make their own choices, control their own lives, and live independently. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was a pivotal victory. It prohibited discrimination against people with disabilities in any program receiving federal funds, laying the groundwork for future disability rights laws. The Gang of 19 in 1978 was a protest where 19 individuals in wheelchairs stopped traffic in Denver to demand accessible public transportation, leading to the formation of ADAPT, and later influencing the ADA's transportation provisions. The Capitol Crawl, or where activists crawled up the steps of the U.S. Capitol to demand swift passage of the Americans with Disability Act, culminating in the 1990 passing of this landmark federal legislation that prohibited discrimination and mandated accessibility in employment, public services, public accommodations, and telecommunications. It was essentially the Civil Rights Act for Americans with disabilities. This movement has shifted the narrative from one of pity or institutionalization to one of rights and disability as a natural aspect of human diversity. It established a legal framework, including the Americans with Disability Act and other amendments, to ensure that the civil rights of people with disabilities were protected in various sectors of society. Ongoing advocacy continues today, addressing new challenges like digital accessibility and ensuring continued enforcement of existing laws. So, while obviously we have made huge and tremendous strides in civil rights in America, there's still a ways to go. I look forward to talking about some of this in class with you guys. If you have any questions or any groups that you think that we didn't cover, please feel free to reach out and let me know. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. All right, bye for now.